Hello everyone. Chapter 3 of The Night the Stars Fell, Nature's Revenge. The next morning it was very early when Mansu got up, as all the village was still asleep. Mansu stood by his doorway looking out. The fires that were burning overnight had gone out, and a few dogs were wandering about, no doubt looking for food and water. When the dogs see Mansu, they all did was wag their tails. Mansu turned round and looked back into his hut, as Tyne and she was cuddling up to MJ, and Dax was cuddling up to Tyne. So when Mansu stood out of his hut, he stretched his arms. The sun started shining over the top of the tall trees, and a mild breeze was slowly blowing through the trees. Mansu decided to go and have a look for himself at what MJ saw, as he didn't have a good night's sleep with the worry of the sun as he went through. So off he went with only a knife which was held by his side by a strong cloth which covered his manhood from the waist down. In fact, he ran most of the way there just to get there quicker. And as he was running, he could feel the warm air going through his hair and feel the breeze brushing past his face. When he did finally get there, nothing seemed different from when he was last there. He walked around the shapes and got to the shape that he stopped at before, and he was looking at it and touched it again to see if the reaction he would get, and he got nothing. As he stood back towards the ground, as he looked down towards the ground, he could see the children's footprints, and the footprints went around the shape. So he started to look at the size of the shape, and was looking closely to see if there was anything that could stick out or any panel that the children were talking about. He couldn't see anything, but the shape was still showing the two different colours, red and yellow. Mansu couldn't understand what happened to his son. So he went back to his village. By the time he got back, the village was up and awake, with everyone doing what they do every day. The men had gone out hunting for food, and the women cleaning the pots and pans, ready for use for cooking. Other women washing clothes down by the riverside, which was about a 10-minute walk away, and the children were playing with each of their dogs. The village looked normal. Dax looked at his mum and dad, and Dad had got back, and Tyne came out of the house shouting that Mansu had come to the hut and have a look at MJ, which Mansu did. MJ was covered in a red rash from head to toe, and it had a fever to go with it. Mansu and Tyne didn't know what to do. Tyne was sick with worry and panic and not knowing what MJ had. So Mansu ran out of the hut and ran to the other children who went with his son, and called them to him, and he looked at them all to see if they had the same as MJ, and luckily enough, all the children were all okay. Mansu couldn't understand that all the children that went there, but the son was the only one with a rash. By this time, Tyne shouted to Mansu again to come back, which he did do that, and he ran right into the hut and could see that MJ had got the fever had got the better of him, and could hear him saying all the planets and stars flying everywhere, and though it was all so dark, you could hear the fear in his voice, but MJ was still asleep. Little did Mansu realise that with the fever, MJ was hallucinating about what happened to him. This got Mansu worried. He got his men together and went with him to the first place with knives, spears and bows and arrows. They started again towards the shape, but he was thinking that no one or nothing hurts his family and gets away with it. So all the men were running around towards the shapes. By this time, Yaris found out what was going on, and when one of his friend's boys had befriended one of his young boys in Mansour's village, and he was sent to warn Yaris with what was going on and what had happened to MJ. So Yaris did no more, but got the men that went with him the first time, and they started going towards the shapes. And Yaris got to the shapes and met up with Mansour and his men. Yaris asked Mansour how was MJ. Mansour was telling him how he was. Mansour was very angry about what had happened to his son, and Yaris was so shocked to hear that we didn't know any more of the kids from either village had to suffer or get hurt, do we? Mansour agreed, so both chiefs got their men to collect as much wood together, as much as they could carry. The men went off and picked up loads of branches from the ground, even broken branches from the trees, and collected as much as they could. Once they got the branches, they would put them down and around, and loads more. While the men were doing this, both Mansour and Yaris were looking around the shape to see if they could find an opening of some kind, but no, there was nothing. This didn't help them at all, and they both were getting angry. So Yaris said, "Then we will burn them to the ground, burn them from the outside then." Mansour agreed. With all the men got more than enough wood, that the shapes would be covered. And as the shapes were about 12 feet high, there had to be enough wood for each of them. So all the men covered one shape from bottom to top and set it on fire. They had to do one at a time as they were so big. So as the wood took light, the fire started to get big, and sparks were coming off the wood and flying into the sky. And as the day was getting on, the smoke from the wood fire was getting thick, and the cinders were getting near the other trees. The men were even cutting down the trees that were near, as they wanted to make sure there was enough wood for burning the shapes. Now most of the day had gone, and they were still gathering wood for the rest of the shapes to be burned. All the men decided to stay there and watch over it. They knew then it was going to be a long night. While doing them one at a time as night fell, and it was way the men got most of the wood. They all sat down weary, and they all gathered and was eating and laughing. For a moment they had forgotten why they were there in the first place. So as time went by, it was quiet, and all the wood was still burning. When morning came, all the men woke up. Mansour woke up Yaris of the basement, look on his face and pointing. And Yaris sat up quick and looked to where Mansour was pointing. And there they sat and looked. The wood had burnt away, but the shapes were still there. Not a burn mark on it, not even a scratch. Nor did it look hot. The burnt wood around it was still hot and smouldering, but the shapes weren't even touched. It still shone its two colours. This had Mansour worried, as he thought to himself, if they can't be burnt and can't be damaged in any way, what can the shapes do to them? Even though they had never moved from the spot where they had landed. Why are they here? Where did they come from? And why did they pick their island? All sorts of thoughts were going through Mansour's mind. But the main thought was that, can the shapes What can the shapes do to them if they did move? And how would they move? So Mansu told his men to stay there and keep watch while he goes back to see how his son is. So his men stood guard, and Yaris told Mansu, "We need to talk, so we can sort out what we can do about these shapes. How can we get them out of the forest?" Mansu agreed and said, "Come back to my village and we can talk there." And Yaris agreed. Both sheep chiefs and all the men went back to the Mansu's village, and by the time they got back there, they were all hungry. So Mansu said, "Let's eat. Let's all eat first and we can talk." And that's what they did. As they sat outside Mansu's hut and started to eat the food, they were given not one person spoke. After they had all eaten, that's when Mansu and Yaris went into Mansu's hut and sat at the back where MJ was. He still wasn't any better, still had the red rash all over his body, and the fever was still there. He was still groaning about the inside of the shape. So Mansu was talking about how they can destroy the shapes, as the burning didn't seem to do it. Mansu said, "What if we can drag them away from here? The further away the better." And before Yaris could answer him, there was a shouting outside the hut. Both men ran out and they could see a woman going into hysterics shouting, "My child has gone." And all the women started saying the same thing, shouting their child had gone. They were crying and screaming. The men and women were running around looking for their children, but they were nowhere to be seen. All the village had gone into panic mode. Even the dogs were barking and were running around. Mansu was angry, and the children weren't being looked after like the women should have done. So all the men, including Mansu and Yaris, and the men started looking everywhere. Then the men started heading towards the forest to see if the children wandered out there. As they were heading towards the shapes, all the men were calling the kids' names, hoping that at least one would reply, but not one word was heard. The kids never shouted back, so with the women having to stay behind just in case the kids returned, Yaris sent one of his men back to his village to get more men to help with the search. Mansu and his men split up and were still shouting out the kids' names, and they were heading towards the shapes just in case they went there. When they got to the shapes, the men that Mansu stood guard were all there. Were all down unconscious, and some of the shapes had their panels open. Most of the kids were inside the shapes, and the children that never went in, as soon as they could see Mansu turn up, run as fast as their little legs could, let them get back to the village. The kids that were in the shapes couldn't get out quick enough and ran towards the village as well. The men that were there unconscious had to be carried back to the village. Well, you can imagine how Mansu was feeling. He was not a very happy man at all. So Yaris went back to the village with his men, and the same with Mansu and his men, with the unconscious man being carried back to the village as well. When Mansu got back home, everyone was quiet, and that included the children. Mansu was very angry and was getting to be early evening, and he was tired and worn out. All he could hear was the crackling of the fire that the women had got started. So Mansu told the men, "Carry the unconscious men and take them back to their huts," and told the women that he wanted to see the men as soon as they wake up. The women made the children stay in their hut. As Mansu was walking back to his hut, he was thinking, what made the other children want to go into the shape? What did they see? By the time he reached his hut, Mansu was now getting tired. Once in the hut, he went straight to MJ to check on him, and the fever he had was slowly going, which pleased his dad. So he did no more and laid down beside MJ and went to sleep, and he slept all night. By morning it was raining, thunder and lightning, the air was humid, and the rain cooled down the temperature, which pleased Mansu. That morning most of the village stayed in their huts, but the women still had to do their work, so they did what they could under cover. The men still went out hunting for food. But Mansu, even after his long night's sleep, was still tired from the last 24 hours. It really took its toll on him, and MJ's fever had all gone, which pleased Mansu very much. The only thing that MJ had left was a few rashes left on his back, but other than that, he was up and about being his normal self. So Mansu asked MJ what he saw, and MJ told him there were stars everywhere, lots of shapes like the ones we have here. But what MJ means is that he saw lots of planets, shooting stars, and it had amazed him being in the dark. What frightened him the most was not knowing where the door was to let him out. So that afternoon, when the weather started to change for the better, the sun trying to shine through the tall trees, the children that went into the shape had come down with the same red rash and fever. So Mansu went to them and said, well, and asked them what they saw, and because they went into the shape that MJ had gone into, they all said the same thing. The children said they wanted to see what MJ saw in the shape and made him run out with fear. Mansu left them and was on his own way back to his hut when he stopped and spoke to the men that had been unconscious to find out what happened to them. And they only remember seeing the children running towards them, and that was it, and that was all. Even they didn't know what happened to them. And when Mansu returned to his hut, he gave an order for some of the men to build another hut for the children who had the rash and fever. He didn't know how dangerous the rash could get, and he didn't want the rash to spread. The men started making a hut. It didn't take them long, and they worked into the night just to get it finished. Even the men who were unconscious looked like they had a rash but no fever. By the morning the rain had stopped and the hut was made, and all the children that had the rash went into the hut with the men. A week had passed, and the shapes were still there. The children were not allowed to go anywhere near it, and the chiefs now know that the shapes can't be burnt down. The shapes are still in the same place where they landed. So Mansu gave a few of his men and told them to bring the ropes and knives to them. On the way back to the shapes, Mansu was thinking, how could they move them? They got there. His men tied ropes around the tree as they pulled, hoping the shapes would move. But not one shape didn't move. It looked as if the shape had embedded itself into the ground. At the same time that they were trying to move the shapes, they could hear a humming noise from above them. They thought it was first coming from the shapes, when in fact it was coming from above. So they all stopped and looked up. And with the sun shining in their faces, they couldn't see much but see a metal object in the sky. They thought it was more coming, so the object hovered above them for a few minutes and moved away into the distance, which pleased Mansu. He didn't know what it was, and not knowing what was going on. So the men just went back into trying to move the first shape, but it was stuck fast into the ground. Mansu decided to go back to the village with his men, as he was not happy not being able to move the shapes. So when they arrived back to the village, Mansi went back into his hut and was very quiet and asked Time to leave as he wanted to be alone and to get him some food. Time got him food and left the hut with the boys. And while he was eating and the evening came in, he was doing a lot of thinking. And then he thought, I have an idea. He would go and see Yaris in the morning. It was too late to see him now. So that is the end of chapter 3. Next week, chapter 4. See what happens.